Hello, my name is Amy Limpetlaw, and I am the head librarian at the Boston University School of Theology Library. The library has sponsored this series of video interviews of faculty members of the School of Theology. Our goal is to showcase, through these interviews, the current work of our faculty authors. Each video runs around 20 to 30 minutes and focuses on a recently published book by the faculty member. We hope these interviews will serve to introduce you to the remarkable work going on at the School of Theology. Enjoy.
Good afternoon. My name is Mason Lee, and I'm a Master of Sacred Theology student here at the Boston University School of Theology, studying homiletics and practical theology. And I'm joined today by Dr. David Schnasa Jacobsen. He is the professor of the practice of homiletics at the Boston University School of Theology, director of the Homiletical Theology Project, and most recently the author of the Gospel of Mark commentary for the Fortress Biblical Preaching Commentary series released from Fortress Press. Dr. Jacobsen, thank you for sitting down with us this afternoon to talk about your commentary.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I guess the place to start is why another commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and maybe more specifically, why one aimed at preachers of all people?
You know, one of the things that I've noticed is that we sometimes don't take full cognizance of the fact that when we look at Mark through the eyes of the lectionary is really operating as a lens for interpreting Mark. So a commentary like this is also important because we don't ever simply approach Mark without any sort of lens at all on a Sunday morning, but we receive it in part through the lens that the lectionary provides. So one thing this commentary does that most don't is to reflect on the choices that are made in constructing the lectionary relative to what we hear from Mark on a Sunday-to-Sunday basis. For example, about 3/4 of Mark appears in the Revised Common Lectionary over the course of year B, the second cycle of the lectionary, which means that there's about 23% left out. So Mark is covered more than most of the synoptic or any other gospels in the Bible, but still there are things left out. And I'm kind of curious, why would it be left out? What do we lose in the process, and what do we gain by covering the text that we do? And even more importantly, of the text we do read, how does all that affect the way we understand it? And for me then, that question becomes theological. That the way we interpret Mark is never simply a matter of exegetical interest, but the lenses that we bring to it and the way we theologically appropriate it for preaching becomes important. So we do all our historical and literary work in this commentary like so many other commentaries do, but we think of the preacher as someone who's receiving this text not only through the lens of the lectionary, but through the lens of being their own theologian where they are.
Yeah, I appreciate the connection with the lectionary. I'm actually preaching this coming Sunday, so I'm particularly thankful for the commentary and the connection with the lectionary. One of the things I appreciate most is that explicit connection with the pericope from the Gospel of Mark and where it's set in the Revised Common Lectionary in year B. And I guess one of the questions I have is it seems as though one of the struggles those preachers who use the lectionary face is this tension between how do you balance the theology of a particular text in terms of its literary whole, but then also in light of the theology of the particular day or Sunday that the lectionary has set up. How did you balance that tension to pay respect to both? And then what advice do you have for preachers generally and how to negotiate that, what a lot of us would say is a challenge of lectionary preaching?
Well, I agree it is a challenge, and I'm one of those people who loves the lectionary. I preach from it most of the time, but I'm aware that the lectionary doesn't always work for every text or even in every situation that parish ministry throws at you. So I'm of the opinion that the lectionary is a very good gift, but it need not be a straitjacket. So what I like to do is to invite the students that I work with, and I also do this myself, to look very closely at what Mark is about in structuring a particular pericope the way that he does, the way it functions in terms of his own literary interests, the historical forces that may have helped create it, and ultimately the theological perspective that Mark's own point of view embodies. Once we do that and honor the text in all of its otherness, then it becomes important to think very clearly about how this lectionary lens is affecting the way we read it. 9 times out of 10, I think the relationship there, even though the a lectionary committee is a 20th century phenomenon and Mark is a 1st century phenomenon, it's almost always a profitable dialogue between the two. Sometimes you're right, they're in tension. And at that point, I think every preacher, as the residential theologian, needs to make a decision about how they proceed next. Sometimes it may actually be okay and helpful for the preacher to kind of push back on the lectionary committee just a little bit, to explore some aspect of theology or theological understanding that a contemporary appropriation of Mark might offer that renews the church in this time and place. I hope preachers learn to be good critical interpreters of Scripture and yet strangely open to the newness that a text as odd as Mark might offer.
One of the things I appreciate about what you do in the commentary is you assign this responsibility of the preacher as a resident theologian. It really comes through not just in the commentary but in your larger work. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested about how you understand the unique ways in which preachers then approach the text, if they understand themselves as, first and foremost, as theologians coming to this text. How do you think that changes how we approach the text of the Gospel of Mark for preaching?
Yeah. Well, in one respect, it's not at all different from what any other interpreter would do, and that is simply, as I mentioned, to honor the otherness of the text. I think for preachers, it opens up also a theological value underneath it. There's long been a very strong critical sense since the Enlightenment that we ought to try to unpack the Scriptures the way they are, to do so without being prisoners of a dogmatic tradition. That's all useful and good. But there's also a sense that every preacher engages a text in a certain way that is really operative out of the theological perspective that they bring to the preaching task. So my exegesis prof at Vanderbilt used to say there are text and task-specific reasons for interpreting texts. So when I do text-specific exegesis, I let the text be in all of its otherness, even meeting me in ways that I may not want to be met. But by engaging in task-specific exegesis, I acknowledge and I value the fact that I come at this with my own life relation to the text, to use a Boltmannian term. That I come at this invested as a theologian from the task of preaching. Sometimes we have this notion that what a preacher is someone who takes someone else's exegetical results and then applies them, which sort of turns the Bible into something like Campbell's soup, for which you just need to add a little bit of water locally to make it function and palatable. I've never really believed that's true, and that's why I keep talking about the residential theologian. There's something about being the person who listens to the text on behalf of today's church in the presence of others that is absolutely indispensable for what we do and absolutely crucial for how the gospel will be articulated in this time and place. And for that reason, especially, we need residential theologians.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way in which you're bringing a more pastoral sensitivity, even to the exegesis of a passage than when we typically think of the Bible as this sort of object that we dissect, and you're wanting to say, no, it's much more theological and pastoral than that in the way we approach the text.
Yeah. And I find, the more and more I read into biblical studies, and for me, my PhD is not just in homiletics, but also in New Testament. I have always loved the world of New Testament studies, New Testament methods, always been intrigued by its work. But I'm aware that I bring something extra to it as a homiletician, and that's this task-oriented side of things that actually opens up certain kinds of theological questions in the way that interpretive moment happens. And I just find that so incredibly valuable and something that we need to use more of in the church today. It's a shame that so often we walk away from a text not feeling like there's any living word to be speaking today. And I have to say, I think some of that results from the fact either that we haven't listened to the text closely enough or that we haven't perhaps engaged our own context deeply enough.
Yeah. Speaking of text we typically walk away from, one of the things I thought was very unique was the way you think about Mark apocalyptically, which is not a move preachers, certainly I have not in my own experience. Talk a little bit about how you came to understand Mark functioning in this apocalyptic way. I mean, there's Mark 13 and those chapters that we say, okay, those are apocalyptic, but you're wanting to think about apocalyptic in relationship to the Gospel of Mark
Right.
in much larger ways. Talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion.
Sure. Well, in many ways, the idea is certainly not my own. Within the history of scholarship, there's a huge question as to the importance of the development of apocalyptic thinking for interpreting the New Testament. And of course, there was a big dust-up toward the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th centuries in the study of the Bible that said we can't simply interpret the language of the kingdom of God, for example, as simply the pinnacle of classical liberal theology, as it was in Germany, where we were all human beings together in unity under the fatherhood of God, working progressively toward the kingdom of God. Then along came people like Schweitzer and others who said that no, that there's a strange apocalyptic nature to these New Testament sources that we need to honor if we're going to be truly historical in interpreting them. A later interpreter in New Testament studies, Norman Perrin, has this wonderful phrase that also impacted me down the line. He says, Mark is what he calls an apocalyptic drama. And there's an important insight with that. Not only that there are apocalyptic elements in something like Mark, but that something else Perrin does with his statement is to connect that with specifically another sort of medium or genre, in this case the language of drama. What I think we have in Mark is a gospel, and a gospel seems to be some sort of narrative about the life of Jesus. I don't know if it's a biography or historiography or what. That's all disputed by New Testament scholars. But I am fairly convinced that whatever genre the gospel represents, it is presented here in what I would call an apocalyptic mode. And here I'm relying in particular on the work of people like John J. Collins and Adela Yarborough Collins, who in her commentary on Mark argues that Mark is kind of an eschatological or apocalyptic historiography. I find that really fascinating, that what we have is a gospel narrative in Mark that still is written in what I would call an apocalyptic mode. Mark is not itself an apocalypse, it's a gospel, but there are ways in which apocalyptic keeps popping up all the way through. So we have demons, and we have exorcisms, we have angels, we have resurrection scenes, we've got the heavens being split open while the voice of God announces that Jesus is indeed God's Son. There are all sorts of scenes in this text, even at the point of the crucifixion, where it talks about the sun growing dark while Jesus is crucified in Mark 15, that seem to be reminiscent of a kind of apocalyptic modality or conceptuality that for me colors a lot of Mark. Now on the surface that doesn't sound like very good news, because frankly most of us don't live with our ear to the ground thinking that the apocalypse is about to come. Although living in Boston, we do wonder about the snowpocalypse. At the same time, I think we do experience certain kinds of dislocation in our lives, where we sense that at least the social world that we live in itself is not as stable as we once imagined it to be. And I suppose that's part of the discomfort we have around events in, for example, recent American history like 9/11, that cause us to see the world that we thought was something we could rely on and assume sort of shakes under our feet a little bit. And in that sense, apocalyptic literature and an apocalyptic gospel like Mark can become very helpful for me as a pastoral interpreter to begin to understand the context that people live in a time of being unsettled and dislocated, and still finding some way to name the gospel of God into it.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the canon is it always seems like whatever season the church finds itself in, there's always a book that will speak to that, and books come in and out of prominence or importance depending on what season the church finds itself in. Do you, just curious about your opinion, do you think we're in a season where things written in what you call this kind of apocalyptic mode, do you think we're entering a season where they're going to, where maybe traditionally we've shied away from them, but maybe now the time the church finds itself in, that we might in some ways rediscover these texts?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot to be rediscovered there. I also think the culture is very multifaceted, so I think it speaks to certain elements of our lives. I don't have any illusion that deep down underneath we're all apocalyptic.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. And in fact, that's why the language of modality is important. It's something that's sort of temporary, that infuses maybe certain regions of life with a greater degree of meaning and understanding and possibility. I think, for example, when I look at contemporary American culture, whether we might be actually entering a kind of post-apocalyptic phase. And I say that because of the presence of all these zombie stories on TV and such, that perhaps the way we understand ourselves at this moment is that we have been radically dislocated and have trouble remembering and recognizing our own humanity anymore. And I think there's maybe still a place for apocalyptic to speak into that. But I don't have any illusions that it somehow is going to be that magic bullet that's going to interpret everything. It won't. But what Mark gives us is still important as an apocalyptic gospel. He gives us in bits and pieces something of the good news of God in a very difficult circumstance. Understanding how that comes about in Mark's own history and through the apocalyptic modality or worldview that Mark brings to interpreting the gospel about Jesus Christ is all very helpful and useful. But it also remains only part of the overall witness that we can appeal to. So I'm glad it's there. I'm glad it's not the only note in the score, but I think it's still very useful and helpful in our times.
Would you talk just a little bit about how maybe your work in this commentary and with a particular biblical text, how that has maybe grown out or sprung from your work with your previous work with apocalyptic texts, but then also your work with thinking about how to preach gospel to particular situations in Kairos preaching, one of your other books. How has this maybe grown out of that, or as an extension of that, or I don't like the word application, but application of that? Do you see any continuity there, or how your work previously has funded your work in this commentary?
Well, I'll say two things. First of all, I think one thing that underlies all of them is a strong sense of the importance of eschatology and the role of promise. So one of the things that strikes me about Mark is that it's a gospel that articulates the promise of God in the midst of the failure of the disciples in the church. I think theologically that's such an interesting way to read the fact that the disciples in Mark are usually portrayed as kind of blundering. And why Mark, for example, takes great pains to construct a crucifixion scene that results in the abandonment of Jesus, a very human Jesus on the cross crying out with his last breath, and a strange resurrection scene where the only people who get the good news are said to run away and tell no one, for they were afraid. It is a very strange gospel that way, and I think that prompts some deep reflection about how we understand ourselves relative to a text like this and how we might see ourselves forward. The underlying issue for me is this one of promise and eschatology, that we live our lives in light of a promise from God that animates us for engagement in the world, for faithfulness, for articulating faith in different kinds of contexts. At the same time, we face the reality of our own failure. For those of us who come from mainline churches, we stare failure in the face quite a bit. We've been thoroughly disestablished by the culture at large. And though we still have vestiges of power within the culture, there is a tremendous ecclesiological dislocation that attends all of this. Somehow theologically we need to come to terms with both the ongoing nature of divine promise and the reality of our failure as those who follow Jesus. To my mind, Mark offers an ironic vision in that way, an ironic vision that is strangely hopeful. And that is that Jesus' promise goes on, go and tell Peter and the others that I will go ahead of them to Galilee. The promise is spoken, the women run away and tell no one, and yet nonetheless we have this gospel before us in our hands, Sunday to Sunday. I think that is a wonderful and beautiful mystery of the power of God's promise in the midst of human failure that is important to hold to in a context like ours today. I don't claim to think that it offers me every explanation that I need to reflect on as a theologian in the church today, but I actually find it a very hopeful one. Martha Simmons has this beautiful line that I like to talk about from one of her books of why eschatology and perhaps promise might be important in today's preaching. She says, eschatology is where the sweet by and by meets the nasty here and now. And I really think preaching needs more eschatology. It needs more promise. It needs realism about who we are as God's people in the world. in order for us to articulate gospel anew in our own situation of dislocation.
The final question I have for you is to think about this. The commentary had a timely release. It was out in July of 2004.
Yeah.
We're entering the second Sunday in Lent for year B, and so the Gospel of Mark is the gospel that those of us who preach from the lectionary will be working with and struggling with and walking through most of year B. I'm just curious about what kind of impact you hope your commentary has for preachers who use it in their own preaching, who then that work shows up in congregations as they walk through year B with the Gospel of Mark. What kind of impact do you hope your work has on the congregations who will see and experience what you've written?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I can't help but come back to the church that I know as a United Methodist pastor, and that's the mainline Protestant church, which I feel has become kind of tongue-tied in its present historical moment. And one thing that I really believe in is I think the task of preaching is to name God into the world again. And I think Mark does that in stunning ways, not in obvious ways or in triumphalistic ways, but in ways strangely open to divine mystery through both the promise of the gospel and the reality of human failure and difficulty in following. I would love to be able to see a commentary like this be available to help the church begin to name God into the world again. And I really think that's what I would love to see, because for me, ultimately, preaching is not only one person talking. Hopefully it's the start of a conversation. And it should be the conversation of the church. In which case, by the way, that the residential theologian is not simply the local expert, but the one who instigates and sponsors and empowers conversation among the people of God. And that, to my mind, is really worth the effort.
Well, Dr. Jacobsen, thank you so much for joining us today, and especially for writing the commentary on the Gospel of Mark.
Thank you.